Okay. All right. Well, we don't have to stop. I'm going to pause it now. Starting the recording, by the way. Aaron's line seemed to be fairly consistent, whereas the Mushite or the Shiholite, their line may have been, may not have been as pure. And so that may also explain part of the reason why, especially um, if if Moses's line didn't follow exactly the Aaronid line, Aaron's ancestors or Aaron's um, you know, children and grandchildren and so forth and so on, because um, the Kohanim themselves, specifically the Kohanim, they were in fact, they had specific requirements that they had to follow in terms of you know, who they could marry, who they could not marry, um, and um, and so just as to make them as possibly as pure as possible. Whereas with Moses's line, they're because they were in the north, many of them, and then they were, and we don't know specifically, you know, how they married, and so we
But
don't know specifically the line.
but it
But
doesn't matter who you marry, it's the male line that is counting on this Y haplogroup. So it's who is the ancestor on the male, direct male line. And maybe Aaron and uh, Moses were not brothers and were not from the same tribe, or they may have been from the same tribe, but not from the, not descended both from Levi. They,
well, they were,
I was told that both groups of Kohanim were equally as old, but they were not all descended from the same person.
yeah, that's interesting. But they were but they all were Levium, that's for sure. That's the reason why the Levies are the second, you know, second on the rung. All right, in terms of honors that we the way they how they're treated today. Okay, um, but in ancient times of Levium, they were the ones that basically they're the ones that actually chanted any prayers or they were in the daily service. They were in charge of the music of the temple. Um, they also were the ones that basically washed the feet of the Kohanim before they did the beer cut Kohanim. Um, so anything they could do personally to relegate them, you know, to a lesser position than the Kohen Gadol and Aaron's, you know, generations that followed. So, but anyways, but thank you very much. It's interesting. I will, after I teach this course and take a little bit of a break, I think maybe I'll do a little more research on that. But thank you so much.
And I have something to say about the Levim as well, because my father was a Levi, and he matched over 50% of the Ashkenazi Levim,
Yeah.
and they came from a different haplogroup as well. And so it's a different male ancestor. And they came originally from like north of the Black Sea, but they were supposed to have come down into the Fertile Crescent between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago and joined the Hebrew people at the beginning.
Okay. All right. Well, that could be, you know what, sounds like the basis for another course. So maybe we can talk.
Right.
All right. Anyways, I want to welcome everybody. I am going to begin. Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody received the summaries I said from last week. There's a lot of material there, so I just really tried to highlight it as best I could. And so let us begin with our final session. The Friedman makes the point that in the Deuteronomist, which was he considered either be Jeremiah or Baruch ben Neriah, his scribe, that they knew about J, E, and P. All right, and that he attacks P as being from the lying pen of scribes, and that that quote is found on page 189 or page 208 or 9 of your edition, of the different edition. And when he says the quote there, it says, "How do you say we are wise and Yahweh's Torah is with us? In fact, here it was made for a lie, the lying pen of scribes." And I think this is and Friedman really did a good job in terms of understanding the fact is that um, P knew of J and E, and that the Deuteronomists knew of P as well. Um, they didn't get along. You have to remember again, Jeremiah was a Mushite priest, whereas P clearly was from the line of Aaron. And so essentially this little bit of this attack, this lying pen of scribes that he says is, which reflects Jeremiah's loathing of the priestly class that makes laws to keep him out of the priesthood and cast Moses in a bad light. The fact that Jeremiah quotes P indicates that the P stories were written before King Josiah dies in 609 BCE. P was produced between 722 BCE and 609 BCE, 722 being the time when the northern kingdom was conquered by Assyria, and 609 when Josiah dies, and when he was killed by the Egyptians. And Friedman strongly believes that he wrote during the reign of King Hezekiah. The Mushite or the Shiloite priests, along with thousands from the northern kingdom, migrate south to Jerusalem. They bring with them their Torah, filled with their stories and their traditions. And some of those stories were similar to those of the Aaronite priests, and many were not. In a sense, Hezekiah became the referee between the two groups. His choice was clear. During his reign, religion was centralized. He divided the priests into Aaronite priests and Levitical priests, and only the Aaronite priests in Jerusalem could perform sacrifices. This makes sense because Hezekiah followed most of the policies established by Solomon. And so if we turn to, in your books, to page 109, 190, I'm sorry, or 209 or 210, close enough. And in the middle of the page, he says, and Hezekiah established the divisions of the priests and the Levites, according to their divisions, every man according to his task, for the priests and for the Levites. So, so just to try to, so in this sense here, and it was Hezekiah who destroyed the bronze serpent, the staff Nehushtan, which was made by Moses. And at this point, I'm going to share something with you on the screen. This is taken from the Hertz Chumash, excuse me, from the Chumash Eitz Chaim. It'll come up in a second. There we go. I promise it'll be up. There we go. All right. So we see here, this is taken from Parshat Chukat, Numbers 21, verse 5. And here it says right here in verse 9, Moses made a copper serpent and mounted it on the standard. When anyone was bitten by a serpent, he would look at the copper serpent and recover. Now, why was this done? So just to go back a little bit, at the top of the page there, the people are fetching. What else is new? All right, they're always fetching. Okay, so why did you make us leave Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread and no water, and we have come to loathe this miserable food, which is they're referring to the manna. Okay, that was really the soy of their day. You know, you could do anything with it with a little flavor. The Lord sent the seraph serpents against the people. They bit the people, and many of the Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord to take away the serpents from us." And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a seraph figure and mount it on a standard. And if anyone who is bitten looks at it, he shall recover." And then it goes on to say, Moses made a copper serpent and so forth and so on. This is Nehushtan. This is the serpent. Having been reduced to second-class priests and the importance of Moses diminished, Hezekiah, interestingly, does not destroy the high places built under Solomon. And he does this because he pretty much agreed with the policies of Solomon, and he wanted to maintain them. And so therefore, he left those high places that were built under Solomon alone. They were destroyed by Josiah, as was written by Jeremiah, a Hushite priest, in First and Second Kings. Hezekiah, on the other hand, is portrayed as the protagonist in First and Second Chronicles. So that we get this history, these books that are written, and on page 191 and 210, at the top of the page here, it says, Josiah, the darling of the Shiloh priest, destroyed the altars of Solomon. Hezekiah, the darling of the Aaronite priest, destroyed Nehushtan. The tie between the two most favored kings and the two great priesthood documents D and P, Friedman says, are fascinating. And down near the end of that paragraph, the laws and the stories of P reflect the interest, the actions, the politics, and the spirit of the age of Hezekiah, the way the D reflects the age of Josiah. So we're starting to get a fairly clear picture here of this particular period. And of course, after Josiah dies, then there's a whole period of where they have four different kings, the worst of who was Manasseh, who allowed idol worship and worshiping other gods. And of course, that was a great sin. Kings and Chronicles are very similar. So why do we need two accounts of this period in Israel's history? Because they differ in their perspectives and facts about the kings described in this period. Like the J.E., D, and P stories and laws, the books of Kings and Chronicles presented a dilemma. They were filled with contradictions and were similar in many ways. Someone brilliantly set out a course to navigate the murky waters by resolving these issues. He combined these different traditions into what we know as the Bible, and that person was the redactor, who he refers to as R. If it would possibly be that if people could mute themselves, because I'm getting some feedback. All right. That'd be great. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Friedman asked and answered the question, if Moses did not produce these books, who did? And therefore he says he thinks it was Ezra. R came from the Aaronite priests. Either he was a priest or he was sympathetic to their situation. And let me just stop sharing the screen here for now. Okay. He was sensitive to the fact that Moses and Aaron, that the Moses and Aaron camps had their stories and laws. J and E and D favored Moses, and P was clearly pro-Aaron. Doublets of creation, the flood, Korach's rebellion, and hitting the rock came at the same story by favoring their own hero. Friedman states that R began Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers with P stories and laws, never with J or E. Then he used priestly documents as the framework for the work. He uses the Book of Generations that had apparently been known for some time, and he broke it up into sections to reflect the genealogy of the human race, from Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, and so forth and so on. He uses the Book of Generations as a transition from one major character in Genesis to another, or to complete their history. For example, R inserts the genealogy of Ishmael after Abraham dies. He inserts the genealogy of Esau after Isaac dies, and Jacob and Esau bury their father. Now the focus is entirely on Jacob and his sons through the end of Genesis. So he took this book of Generations, and he brilliantly used the lineage to really, as almost like the way that we would use in the service the Kaddish. The Kaddish for our liturgy are dividing points. They separate certain services. So we use for the Birchot Shachar, we have a Kaddish, we have a mourner's Kaddish. For between the end of Pesukei de Zimra and the formal part of Shacharit before Yishtabach, we have a Kaddish. And after the Shacharit's completed, we have a Kaddish Shalem, and so forth and so on. So you can see. So the idea of the fact is that the redactor, he used this method, using the Book of Generations as a way of ending a story and starting another one. Okay. Any questions at this point? All right. The first 15 chapters of Exodus are structured using a priestly text. How do we know? Another list. This time, the sons of Jacob that settled in Egypt at the end of Genesis. The majority of the first 15 chapters is comprised of the 10 plagues, a detailed descriptions of the commandment to observe Pesach, and ending with the Song of the Sea, the Shirat Hayam, which is traditionally read on the 7th day of Passover, in addition to its regularly assigned place in the Torah reading cycle, and that's the Shabbat that we call Shabbat Shirah. Okay. Other examples of R's handiwork are Numbers in chapter 15, verses 1 through 31, found in Parshat Shalach Lecha, which contain the spy story and the commandment to wear tzitzit, the fringes, which is the very last paragraph of the Shema, the 3 paragraphs of the Shema Yisrael that we recite every day. Numbers 15 was placed by the redactor between the spy story and Korach's rebellion, which actually takes place in chapter 16. Friedman says this is a doublet. P had already written about this earlier in Leviticus 4. So why put it there? Because Leviticus 4 specifically states that the sacrifices were to take place in front of the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. Numbers 15 does not mention the tabernacle at all. Friedman uses this as a proof that it was written by the redactor and during the Babylonian exile or during the Second Temple period. P inextricably links the tabernacle to sacrifices. R does not. There is a second reason why Numbers 15 is situated between the spy story and the rebellion. All those scouts, except Joshua and Caleb, whose negative reports about the land caused the people to mutter against Moses, died from a plague. Because the people did not have faith in God, the Israelites were condemned to wander the desert for 40 years until they died out. Stricken with guilt and grief, it seems only natural for the redactor to insert sacrifices about sin, guilt, and atonement, but no mention of the tabernacle. One final example that Friedman uses to prove that R was writing during the Second Temple period is from Leviticus 23 in Parshat Amor, which is read on the festivals. The P source, I'm quoting Friedman, the P source gives laws that list the 3 main holidays, the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths, and also the New Year and the Day of Atonement holidays. Verses 4 through 37 begin and end with, these are the holidays of Yahweh, Ele Moadei Adonai. But Friedman points out another law is added about one of the holidays, the Feast of Booths, Sukkot. In the book of Nehemiah, when Ezra reads the Torah to the people, they realize the commandment to live in booths for 7 days had never been observed. And so what I want to show you, again, I'm going to share the screen here. So we have down here at the bottom, you can see that I have marked off in brackets. It says, mark on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the yield of your land, you shall observe the festival of the Lord to last 7 days, a complete rest, on the first day, and a complete rest on the 8th day. The 8th day actually being Shmini Atzeret. On the final day, on the first day, you shall take the product of the hadar trees, branches and palm trees, boughs and leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. We're talking about the etrog and the lulav, okay? You shall observe it as a festival of the Lord for 7 days in the year. You shall observe it in the 7th month as a law for all time, throughout the ages. You shall live in booths 7 days. All citizens in Israel shall live in booths, in order that future generations may know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt, I, the Lord your God. So Moses declared to the Israelites the set times of the Lord. So if we look on page 201 and 220, so he asked the question, Friedman, in the middle of towards the bottom of the page. He said, what is this all about? Why does this one law about one particular practice on one holiday appear separately after the end of the holiday section? The answer lies in the days of the Second Temple. And so again, he's referring to this, and the quote down, it says, the children of Israel had not done so from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, until that day. So they had never, ever, the custom of living in booths had never been practiced. And we're to assume also that probably that even the etrog and lulav was not used. So this whole idea of the festival of Sukkot, even though it was commanded in the Torah, clearly it was added at a much later date. And why? Because at the second temple period, that this was something that obviously was a practice that had begun. So as I previously mentioned, Friedman believes that Ezra was the redactor. In chapter 8, Friedman states that in the entire Bible, quoting him, in the entire Bible, only 2 men are mentioned as lawgivers, Moses and Ezra. Ezra was a priest, a lawgiver, and a scribe. He had access to the documents. And on page 202, we see specific quotes from the book of Nehemiah. Now, and it says, Ezra had his heart set on seeking Yahweh's Torah. He was a ready scribe in the Torah of Moses. And it also reports that the emperor authorized him to teach and enforce the law of your God, which is in your hand. Now near the bottom of the page, it says the first time that we find the full Torah of Moses in Judah, it is in Ezra's possession. He sought it out. He was a scribe who worked with it. He personally carried it to Jerusalem, and he personally gave it its first public reading. And when he read it to the people, they heard things that they had never heard before. So an important thing to remember was that by Ezra's time, all the sources apparently had come to be attributed to Moses. This was crucial in understanding why Ezra, an Aaronid priest and scribe, would make Moses the human hero of the Torah. I put in human. I wanted to emphasize that because obviously we're talking about the fact that it was God that brought it out of Egypt, and it was God's miracles that carried us forward in the desert for 40 years. But Moses was the shaliach. He was the human representative for God on earth. And so he set out to combine the versions into the first attempt at writing history. When you really think about it, it was actually really brilliant what he did. And on pages 209 and 228, whichever version you have, at the top of the page, it says the redactor organized these sources into the flow of history by using 3 documents. First, the Book of Generations, which I've already spoken of. The second document he used was the P plagues narrative. He used this language of Pharaoh's heart was strengthened as a framework that united the various J, E, and P stories of the Exodus from Egypt. The structure covered the first 12 chapters of the book of Exodus up to the moment of the people's departure from Egypt. The third document was a list of the stops that the Israelites made during their 40 years in the wilderness. This itinerary list is now located in the book of Numbers, chapter 33, and it begins with an explicit statement. It's actually from Matot Maseh that we read during the summer, and a lot of people don't really, get into it. But it says here in the quote, "These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out from the land of Egypt." Now, so special are these journeys and the references to it that they're actually chanted to a specific trup from when reading the Torah, a little more majestic. And so if you are in shul, well, hopefully if any of us are in shul, but if we have to do it on Zoom or on live stream, that you would be able to hear it. So a really good Baal Koreh, a person who is a master of the Torah reading, will recite these and chant them in the appropriate melody. So once he had the first 4 books completed, he added Deuteronomy, which already was a continuous unit, depicting the last words and actions of Moses. All he had to do was move the J, E, and P stories of Moses' death to the end of Deuteronomy. The last chapter, 34, is now a combination of all 3 versions of Moses' death, J, E, P, and D. Whether Ezra intended to or not, by adding Deuteronomy to the first 4 books of the Torah, he created a natural continuity from Genesis to the end of 2 Kings, 2 Kings. So what can we take away from the final product that we call the Bible? We have a history from the creation of the world and humans, of the ancient Jews, beginning with Abraham through Moses, and the history of the Israelites to the destruction of the first temple in the Babylonian exile. God is portrayed in very personal terms, as seen through the eyes of J, E, and D. P's conception was more of a cosmic, transcendent deity. Third, God is just and merciful. We see this dual description of God. Examples, the fact is that that after Cain kills Abel and actually hides from God, knowing that he did wrong, that God did not kill him. Instead, do you remember what God did? Anyone can unmute? He put a mark on his forehead. Put a mark on his forehead, which we call the mark of Cain, and that he was going to live with that mark on him for the rest of his life, and walk the earth, and everyone would know that he was a murderer. He was, because that was the first murder that we have encountered in the Bible, and it's early on, out of jealousy, because God accepted Abel's sacrifice but didn't accept Cain's sacrifice, and Cain was jealous. As a matter of fact, there is I would say probably in the 1970s, 80s, a movement started up looking at the Bible not as a religious document, the Bible as literature. And actually, in Newton North High School is where the course actually began. And it was actually taught as literature. And one of the stories that they have is the story about what is said between Cain and Abel when Cain goes out to the field where Abel is working, and they have this conversation that leads to an argument that leads to Cain killing Abel. And because we don't have that, it just says he goes out and he killed, and they argued, and that was it. We don't know what was said between the two of them. So, and the fact that God didn't kill Abel, but he punished him by letting him know that, like, and maybe like a parent would want to teach a child a lesson, that you need to take responsibility for yourself, and this is your punishment. There are consequences for your actions. Another aspect from what we can take away from the creation of the Bible and its construction, that it's a book filled with many stories of the human condition, and that the interaction of humans with an invisible God, whom they struggle to faithfully follow, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And fifth, the Bible is thus a synthesis of history and literature, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension, but utterly inseparable. And if we look on page 222, or 241, I felt that this was important, that I read this in just the way that he had it, that Friedman wrote it himself. Down towards the middle of the page there, it says, reading the Bible will never be quite the same. Aware of the Bible's extraordinary history and its resulting complexity, we can and probably must read the book with a new depth of appreciation. We can read a page of the Bible and know that 3 or even 4 persons, all artists, all writing from their own experience in their own historical moments, separated by centuries, contributed to composing that page. And at the same time, we can read the page as it is, to enjoy the story, to learn from it, to find out how others interpret it over millennia. For those of us who read the Bible as literature, this new knowledge should bring a new acquaintance with the individuals who wrote it, a new path to evaluating their artistry, and a new admiration for the book's final beauty and complexity. For those of us who read it in search of history, this enterprise continually opens new channels to uncovering what was happening in various historical moments, and new sensitivity to how individuals in biblical society responded to those moments. For those who hold the Bible as sacred, it can mean new possibilities of interpretation, and it can mean a new awe before the great chain of events, persons, and centuries that came together so intricately to produce an incomparable book of teachings. And for all of us who live in this civilization that the Bible played so central a part in shaping, it can be a channel to put us more in touch with people and forces that affected our world. The question, after all, Friedman says, is not only who wrote the Bible, but who reads it. Now, I purposely chose not to keep on picking out different examples of how Friedman goes on to prove that, that it was Ezra the scribe, and that and all of the and how as the redactor, and all the different ways that he was able to, how he was able to literally bring some of his own writing and the shaping of it, and the placing of different parts of different stories, and creating just a seamless continuity of thought, which was absolutely brilliant. I really felt that I didn't want to, even though it's like an hour and a half that we have here, I didn't feel that that was what was important. What was important is that I just wanted to get a good sense of what Friedman was trying to convey, and also to leave open now some time for questions and anything that was not clear, or that hopefully that I might be able to answer. I do want to point out one thing. In the edition that I have, he has an epilogue. And then realizing it long after I made the syllabus, that the other edition does not have this epilogue. What's interesting in this epilogue is that he shows that archaeological studies, more so than in the past, since he first wrote the book, is that archaeological studies are now starting to support the actual events that took place in the Bible. He says the analysis in who wrote the Bible was based on the history of ancient Israel, including the reign of King David. Some scholars claimed that there never was such a kingdom of the house of David. But in an inscribed stele, S-T-E-L-E, was discovered in excavations in 1993 that referred specifically to the king of the house of David. Then a corrected reading of a Moabite stele, the Mesha stone, which is found in the Louvre in Paris, France, revealed a second reference to the house of David in 1994. And excavations in Jerusalem uncovered monumental architecture from the time of David. Another factor is, which is kind of interesting now, that Orthodox scholars and laypersons are starting to come to terms with the hypothesis that the Torah was in fact written by different authors and then redacted by one person who put this all together. And he actually mentions there aren't a lot of them, but they're starting to slowly come around, which is really interesting, because obviously if it's Torah Sinai and they believe that that God is the one who gave it to Moses, or asked Moses to write it down, commanded Moses to write it down, that has been the tradition. So that's also an important point that he brought out. And one other thing that he said that was interesting. He said some had argued against the documentary hypothesis. This is what we're talking about, the documentary, using these different documents and putting together, saying that no ancient work was ever composed that way, with multiple authors compiled by editors, including double versions of the same stories. But a group of scholars published a whole collection of ancient texts that were composed in just this way. And it goes on to say that the continuity of the sources when separated from one another, however, is contrary to all supplementary hypotheses. This continuity is readily visible in Hebrew in the Westminster Leningrad Codex and in English in the Bible with sources revealed. These are books that he's describing. Some would say they would not believe the documentary hypothesis unless we could find one of the source texts intact prior to its being combined with the others, meaning a text of just J or just E. In fact, such a text does exist. It would have to be much older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest existing text, so that these skeptics must have figured that it would be impossible to produce such a text. And he cites a scholar, William Propp, who found a text in Ezekiel that quotes a priestly text from the Pentateuch, and which is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The text is interrupted in the Pentateuch by other texts, but Ezekiel quotes the text intact without the intervening texts, and he does give reference to it. So since he wrote the book, and since his second edition, which was in 2002, more evidence has come to light, archaeological and more scholarly, so that this is something that we should really for me, it's fun. That's all. And I hope that, that after that you will continue to do this. At the back of the book, and I'm not sure exactly what page is on, and you will find it in the other edition, but in the edition that I have, in the appendix, this is where I think this is absolutely, can you imagine the painstaking work that he that Friedman put into this, the identification of the authors of the 5 books of Moses, book by book, author by author, the verses that he quotes and where they are and where they're found. And this is really just I think it's just a brilliant way of approaching it. And so you have an assignment now for the next several years, is to really, to look at this and to enjoy it. I started doing this even while I was doing the research and preparing for the course. And I said, I could do this forever, but I think the people, especially at this hour of night, would not really appreciate it. But you do. You can take your time to do this. Take the Eitz Chaim or any Chumash and look up these verses, and you can just see how brilliantly that he put them together. Okay. So that's it. I'm done. And I hope that everybody, and Marcy just, she actually texted me, is this okay, Marcy, if I say this? All right. So Marcy says she's hoping that there won't be a quiz. All right. So, yeah. So there will not be a quiz, Marcy. All right. Okay. You're happy now? All right. Yeah, I just really, I think that this is it's fun. And again, especially tonight, where there is so much to learn from this and so much to glean, that I tried to keep this as fresh as I possibly could without overwhelming it with a lot of details. Again, so any questions at all? Yes, Robert.
Yeah, it says on page 224 in my copy about the Ezra. It says that the books of the Bible were destroyed by fire after the burning of the first temple.
Right.
And that Ezra wrote it by revelation, which sounds like the Quran by Muhammad. So I mean, obviously, if he did it by himself, and obviously he had no sources with him.
Well, one of the things that we do know, and that is that that these stories had been around forever.
Yeah.
And that just because they might have been, written down or in certain places, we don't. It's Ezra, the one that gives us this Torah that we know today, this Torah that we read from every Shabbat afternoon, every Monday and Thursday, every Shabbat, every holiday. This is the Torah that he gave the people. All right. And it's to me, it's just not a coincidence. It's not just coincidence that he brings this Torah, and that whether or not everything had been burned, we don't know. We really don't know. What we do know is that that in the first wave of exile from Judah after the destruction of the temple, we know that that some went to Israel, went to Egypt, like Jeremiah, but many of the scholars and the brightest of the bright went from Judah to Babylonia.
Yes.
And that was on purpose. As a matter of fact, Micha Goodman even talked about it 3 weeks ago when he was talking about Nehemiah, all right? Or even Daniel. Daniel was one of those people that actually he was, the book is not so inspiring when you think of some of the other books, in the Tanakh. But the fact of the matter is that the Nebuchadnezzar knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to bring all of this because he, in terms of the brilliance and the academicians, the teachers, the scholars, and because it was going to help Babylonia. And Babylonia, remember, and Judah was a kind of an ally of Babylonia, and that's why Egypt had come down previously to come down to fight Babylon. And it was Josiah who went out to meet him, and he was killed. in the end, obviously, it didn't make any difference. Babylonia, took over Judah and destroyed the temple and exiled the people. So that, so the people were there. And of course, while they were in Babylonia, many things happened. Our Jewish calendar, for example, many of the names of the months of the Jewish calendar are Babylonian. They're not Hebrew. They're not Jewish. They're Babylonian. Okay. Some of the names of some of our names, like, for example, like Mordechai or Esther, really come from Marduk and Ishtar, the gods and goddesses. So there's this name, we adapt to many of the customs. The custom of wearing a head covering consistently is Babylonian, because in Palestine, they didn't do it. All right. And so when they came back and they brought this custom with them, this was a little bit, like a little foreign to the Jews that actually still remained in Judah at the time, that did not leave and were not exiled. So there's a lot to say, and so we don't know whether or not these stories, the ones that may have been written down, had been brought to Babylonia. But clearly, if I were to speculate, I would say yes, they were. All right, that they had not been destroyed, because I would think that those would be certain things that they would want to protect. The one thing we do know is that the Ark and the tablets of the Ten Commandments, both the complete set and the destroyed and the broken set, we don't see them ever again. Ever again. And so and the tabernacle is never mentioned either. So that those items may have been destroyed, or if they were carried off, who knows where they are. And we're not going to make a movie to figure it out either. So, all right. So that's, so I think that my sense is that Ezra didn't do this just through revelation. Okay.
No.
All right. Yeah. Other questions? Shirley.
My question is, going forward, you're talking about the course in the spring on Exodus. Is it
Okay.
the book Exodus by Richard Friedman,
Yeah.
or is it the story Exodus?
Yes. Well, it's based on the story, obviously. So yeah, but it's his interpretation, and
Okay.
and I'm only halfway through it, so please don't test me. Okay, but yes, it'll be based on that book.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I thought it'd be great to do that. It just as leading up to Pesach, and so it might be nice for some discussion, and hopefully by Passover we might be sharing a table with family members in person and stuff like that. That'd be great. But even if you're doing it on Zoom or FaceTime, whichever virtual platform you choose, these are great things to share. Insight and learning is obviously wonderful. Okay. And Passover, the Seder, is a wonderful time to do it. Well, everybody, thank you.
Well, thank
And I
you.
hope that you learned something from it. I certainly do. Every time I do an adult ed course, or even anytime I teach, even when I teach students, young kids, I always learn something. And I think it's and that's the fun part of doing stuff like this. So everybody,
Okay.
Thank you.
enjoy the rest of Hanukkah. Hanukkah Sameach. Okay, you only have 2 more days left.
Right.
All right. Well, actually 3. We started the 6th day. And remember, it's Rosh Chodesh. So for those of you that'll be joining us tomorrow morning at Minyan at 6:45 in the morning. Okay. We have lots of good stuff, and Chazan Elias Rosenberg will be leading us. And so I think this is one time he will not accommodate the congregation and being slow. He will move as quickly as possible so that we can all get out at a reasonable time. And so everybody enjoy the evening, enjoy the rest of the holiday, stay safe, stay well. And just by the way, just by a show of hands, how many of you are planning to get the vaccine? Okay, all right. And my hand is up. Okay, all right. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. And look
Thank
forward
you,
to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, Samaya.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, my mother always said, Mikol Melamdai Hiskalti. So, same.
Well, you know,
Thank you. I learned a lot.
well, thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. And I hope I did justice to it. Okay. All right. Take
It was
care.
good.
All right.
Take
Thank
care.
you
I'll see
very
you
much.
tomorrow.
Abba, Laila Tov.
Bye, Lato.
Bye, Lato.
Thank you.